When Francis Benfatto first started turning heads in bodybuilding, there was something about him that felt different. In a sport that was becoming obsessed with sheer size, Francis told another story with his physique. He didn't impress through excess, but through harmony. Every muscle seemed to sit exactly where it belonged, creating a look that radiated balance, control, and classic aesthetics. From the very beginning of his journey, he saw bodybuilding as something bigger than just piling on muscle. To Francis, the body was a long-term project, almost a work of art in constant refinement. While many athletes chase size at any cost, he followed a different path, one centered on definition, proportion, and stage presentation. Francis' story starts long before the stages and competitions. As a child, around the age of 11, he was already fascinated by the male physique, the strength expressed through muscle, and the discipline that body seemed to represent. It wasn't vanity-driven aesthetics, but curiosity, a genuine desire to understand how far the human body could go with hard work. During his teenage years, that interest turned into action. At just 14, Francis took his first real steps inside a proper gym, the legendary Beretta Gym in Toulouse, France. There, he found more than weights and machines. He found an environment that would shape his mindset forever. Beretta wasn't an ordinary gym. Powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, and bodybuilders trained side by side, sharing the same space, the same sweat, and the same grind. Every brutal rep was collective, every failure understood as part of the process. Over time, it became clear that bodybuilding wasn't just a hobby for Francis. Even at a young age, he developed what felt like a calling toward training, as if that path had chosen him. Every workout was approached with seriousness, focus, and deep respect for the process. Sacrifice was part of the routine. Francis gave up everyday comforts to invest in what truly mattered, training better and eating better. Instead of spending money on convenience, he saved it for food. Many times, he would walk for over an hour, more than 3 miles, to get to the gym, just to save on transportation and make sure he could afford more protein in his diet. Inside the gym, his passion showed in the details. Francis didn't train just to move weight, but to feel the muscle working. The pump, the feeling of fullness in the muscle, and the deep relaxation after a well-executed session became almost essential experiences. For him, those moments were confirmation that he was on the right path. That connection with his own body helped shape an extremely methodical athlete. Francis began paying close attention to how each exercise responded, how his body reacted to rest, and how nutrition directly influenced performance. When Francis decided to step on stage for the first time, he quickly realized he wasn't competing like most others. His body wasn't the heaviest in the lineup, nor the most intimidating at first glance. But as the poses unfolded, something different started to stand out. The way each muscle flowed into the next, creating a physique that looked bigger, cleaner, and incredibly balanced. It was during this early phase that Francis understood a truth that would define his entire career. The number on the scale never told the whole story. Muscle distribution, a tight waist, dry conditioning, and overall harmony had far more impact on stage than simply being big. That lesson became undeniable in 1982 when he won Mr. France. Even competing at a relatively lighter body weight, Francis looked much larger under the stage lights. The victory wasn't luck. It was the result of extreme preparation, superior conditioning, and symmetry that caught the judges' and audience's attention. From that moment on, the idea that quality beats quantity stopped being a theory and became a non-negotiable principle. Francis understood that if he showed up sharper and more complete than anyone else, he could outclass physiques that appeared bigger on paper. After those early wins, Francis entered a new phase of his career. It was no longer just about dominating nationally, but about proving that his philosophy could stand against the best in the world. With every new prep, he refined his physique even further, bringing the same principle to international stages that had defined him from the start: extreme symmetry and flawless conditioning. That mindset led to one of the most important moments of his amateur career. In 1985, Francis captured the Mr. Universe title in the middleweight division, a win that confirmed his maturity as a competitor. In that moment, he stopped being just a promising name and became a true benchmark in the class, recognized for the consistency and elegance of the physique he brought to the stage. Beyond Mr. Universe, Francis also began to stand out at the IFBB Amateur World Championships. Even when he didn't win, he was consistently among the top contenders, going head-to-head with athletes who were clearly larger in terms of sheer mass. That consistency reinforced the idea that his approach wasn't limited. It was highly competitive, even at the highest amateur level. This phase proved decisive for his mindset. Francis realized he had reached the ceiling of the amateur scene, and staying there would only lead to stagnation. The next step was inevitable, turning bodybuilding not just into a passion, but into his main profession. Turning pro finally placed Francis on the most prestigious stages in the world. It was time to test his philosophy against the sports elite. Competitions like the Mr. Olympia, the Arnold Classic, and major international Grand Prix events became part of his routine, putting his physique side by side with the most imposing names of that era. Backstage and under the lights, the respect was obvious. Francis' level of conditioning stood out immediately. His dry, symmetrical, and incredibly detailed physique contrasted sharply with the ever-growing bodies around him. In 1990, that quality didn't go unnoticed by Joe Weider, who saw in Francis a different kind of athlete, someone who still embodied the classic values of bodybuilding. There was real hope that this style could be rewarded again. The idea that definition, aesthetics, and stage presentation might reclaim center stage in judging felt possible. Francis entered competitions believing that, more prepared than ever, his moment of true recognition at the top of the sport would finally come. But the reality on stage began to tell a different story. Year after year, the criteria became clearer. Extreme size was starting to outweigh every other attribute. Massive physiques, even when less proportional, took precedence, while athletes like Francis were pushed into mid-pack placements, regardless of how polished their conditioning was. That realization hit hard. Francis understood that he wasn't just competing against other athletes. He was up against a structural shift within the sport itself. As the years went on, it became increasingly clear that something fundamental had changed in bodybuilding. Not in his body, which continued to improve, but in the standards that defined the winners. Classic aesthetics, once admired, no longer sat at the center of decision-making. Even when he stepped on stage with extremely refined physiques, the results didn't reflect the level of preparation. Francis knew he was sharper than many of his competitors, but he also understood that sharpness alone was no longer enough. Judging felt more and more predictable, rewarding mass over proportion, size over harmony. That realization was draining, not because of wounded pride, but because he could see that his philosophy no longer had real space to win. He kept training with the same intensity, discipline, and respect for the sport, yet it felt like swimming against a current that couldn't be turned. In 1993, after competing at the Arnold Classic and the Grand Prix events in France and Germany, Francis made a difficult decision. He recognized that staying on the pro circuit meant continuing within a system that no longer valued what he believed in. It wasn't a lack of ability, it was a lack of alignment. And so, Francis brought his professional competitive career to a close, not as a defeated athlete, but as someone deeply aware of his own values. Stepping away from the stage didn't mean stepping away from bodybuilding. It simply meant changing his role. Competition was no longer part of his routine, but training remained the center of his life. Free from the pressure of contests, Francis began to see this new phase as an opportunity to dive deeper into something that had always fascinated him: understanding, with precision, how the body truly responds to training. That's when Francis fully committed himself to a career as a personal trainer. Training other people every single day, he began noticing patterns, limits, and physiological responses across different body types, ages, and experience levels. Each client became, in practice, a new case study. Every mistake and every success turned into a lesson. At the same time, Francis kept experimenting on himself. Even away from competition, he never stopped training seriously. His own body became a living laboratory where methods, volume, intensity, and rest periods were constantly adjusted and evaluated. This phase was crucial in shaping his long-term view of bodybuilding longevity. Without the pressure of stepping on stage, Francis started thinking beyond short-term performance, focusing instead on joint health, recovery, and consistency over the years. It was during this time away from competition that Francis began to notice a clear pattern. The body doesn't respond the same way every day, and forcing fixed weights and rigid routines was often the fastest path to stagnation or injury. From that simple but powerful realization came the foundation of what he would later call ART, or auto-regulation training. The idea behind the method was straightforward. Training should adapt to the body, not the other way around. Instead of chasing rigid numbers, Francis began adjusting load, volume, and intensity based on how his body actually felt that day. Strength levels, fatigue, recovery, and even mental state were all taken into account before each session. Within this system, one tool became central: RPE, or rate of perceived exertion. Instead of asking only, "How much weight did I lift?" Francis focused on a more important question: how hard did that really feel? That honest assessment of effort made it possible to push hard when the body was ready and to pull back when needed, without guilt and without ego. Over time, he realized this approach didn't just reduce injuries, it created steady, sustainable progress. By tracking sensations, effort levels, and performance week after week, Francis could monitor improvement with far greater precision. Training stopped being a brute force game and became a deliberate, intelligent process. With the ART system clearly defined, Francis began organizing his workouts in an even more strategic way. The goal wasn't to train more days or pile on insane volume, but to distribute stimulus intelligently throughout the week. Each session had a clear purpose: legs on one day, major muscle groups like chest and back on another, and shoulders and arms on a third. This structure helped keep training quality high, avoided excessive fatigue, and allowed each muscle group to be trained when it was truly ready to perform. Supersets played an important role in this process. They weren't used for reckless exhaustion, but as a tool for muscular efficiency. Francis believed that hitting a muscle from different angles within the same training block improved density, mind-muscle connection, and overall muscle quality, without relying on extreme loads. Another key element was volume control. Instead of following the more is better mindset, he adjusted sets and reps based on how his body was responding at the time. If things felt good, the session moved forward. If not, adjustments were made, no ego involved. That respect for the body's signals is what allowed him to stay consistent year after year. After years away from competition, Francis had no plans to return to the stage. His focus was daily training, coaching, and the continued evolution of his own physique. But things began to change when he started doing guest appearances in South Africa. While preparing for those appearances, something caught his attention. His body was responding better than ever. Looking at photos, videos, and how he felt after training, Francis realized he was in exceptional shape. Not just for his age, but compared to any other point in his career. Muscle maturity, density, and conditioning were surpassing, in many ways, what he had displayed when he was younger. For the first time, the idea of competing again felt possible and realistic. The decision wasn't impulsive. Like everything in his life, it was carefully thought out. He evaluated how his body was responding, fine-tuned training and nutrition with precision, and followed the same principle that had always guided his career: never push beyond what's necessary. In 2006, at 48 years old, Francis officially returned to the stage at the IFBB Grand Prix Australia. What the audience saw was an impressive physique, extremely defined, dense, and perfectly balanced. For many, that version of Francis was the best he had ever been. Amid all the different phases of his career, there's one record that perfectly sums up what Francis represents. The documentary Strong and Silent isn't just a training video. It's a true portrait of his life philosophy within bodybuilding. Considered the only complete audiovisual record of Francis at his peak, it captures something that numbers and placements could never fully express. The footage takes us through places that shaped his journey. In the south of France, we see the calm environment that molded his personality. Training on the beach, the connection with the ocean, and the natural light reveal an athlete in balance, someone who lives bodybuilding as part of his everyday life, without excess or theatrics. In contrast, the documentary brings Francis to Venice Beach, California, the true heart of the bodybuilding world. There, inside the legendary Gold's Gym, his intensity shows itself in its rawest form. Every rep is performed with absolute focus, proving that behind the calm exterior lies relentless discipline and a quiet, uncompromising work ethic. What makes strong and silent so powerful is precisely this contrast. Outside the stage, Francis conveys serenity, control, and simplicity. Inside the gym, he transforms, displaying precision, body awareness, and a deep connection with every movement. There's no exaggeration, just flawless execution. When looking at modern bodybuilding, Francis offers a direct, no-nonsense assessment. In his view, the sport has drifted away from what it originally stood for. Over time, the scale began to matter more than the mirror, and the pursuit of extreme mass ended up overshadowing aesthetics, proportion, and stage presentation. He doesn't speak from frustration, but from experience. He was there when different physiques shared the same stage, each with its own identity. There was room for variety, and conditioning could elevate a smaller athlete into top placements. Diversity was part of the show, and presentation carried as much weight as muscle size. For Francis, true bodybuilding was always about the complete package. Not just size, but symmetry, definition, density, aesthetics, and stage presence. A physique that impressed from every angle, that communicated balance and control. That's what separated a great physique from one that was simply big. Throughout his career, Francis kept those values as an absolute priority, even when he realized they were no longer the most rewarded. He chose to remain faithful to his own philosophy rather than reshape his body to fit a standard that didn't reflect his vision of the sport. Looking back at Francis' entire journey, it becomes clear that his greatest legacy isn't found in trophies or specific placings. What he left behind is a different way of thinking about the body, training, and time itself. A career built on patience, method, and absolute respect for personal limits. Francis proved, in practice, that bodybuilding can be a sustainable science. While many athletes shine for just a few years and then fade away, he showed that it's possible to improve for decades, maintaining quality, health, and consistency. His physique at 48 wasn't a miracle, but the logical outcome of smart choices made over a lifetime. The main lesson from his story is simple, yet powerful. Quality always beats quantity. Training better matters more than training more. Eating intelligently matters more than eating excessively. And listening to your body is far more effective than ignoring it for the sake of ego. These principles cross generations and remain just as relevant today. More than an athlete, Francis became a symbol of quiet discipline. He never needed to shout, exaggerate, or chase trends to earn respect. His authority came from consistency, between what he believed and how he lived, between what he preached and what he practiced every single day in the gym. In the end, his story leaves an unavoidable question for anyone watching. What is bodybuilding really about? Building a body as fast as possible, or building a body for a lifetime? Francis Benfatto's journey answers that question calmly, without excess, and with the same elegance that always defined his physique.